Hello and welcome to video lecture number 87, today, which is entitled Economy from Recovery to Dominance. Our subsections today are Engines of Economic Growth, A Nation of Consumers, and finally Religion and the Middle Class. So the decades after World War II were marked not only by the Cold War, but also by increasing prosperity for most, though not all, Americans. The war had strengthened, not damaged, the nation's economy. After experiencing want during the Depression and then rationing and shortages during the war years, Americans were now ready and able to go on a post-war buying spree to purchase homes, automobiles, and household appliances, including newly available television sets. Government lent a helping hand. The GI Bill of Rights assisted veterans in purchasing homes, starting businesses, and acquiring higher education or technical training. And the earlier reforms of the New Deal survived largely intact, as did the partial socialization of the risks involved in living in a free enterprise society. The powerful American economy both dominated and sustained the war-ravaged world, further contributing to domestic prosperity. Again, government played a big role, with the Marshall Plan assisting European nations' recovery from the war and subsidizing their purchase of U.S. exports. However, finding the right mix of private enterprise and public policy was one of the biggest political challenges of the post-war era. For some, the key to America's economic power was and remained the corporation, not the government. Reducing taxes on business, the main source of job creation, not paying for public government programs, and a vastly expanded military, which now possessed global reach, was another major challenge. So let's have a closer look then at the state of the post-war economy with our first section, Engines of Economic Growth. By the end of 1945, war-induced prosperity had made the United States the richest country in the world, a preeminence that would continue unchallenged for the next 20 years. American economic leadership abroad translated into affluence at home. Domestic prosperity benefited also a wider segment of society than anyone had thought possible in the dark days of the Great Depression. A meeting at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, established the U.S. dollar as the capitalist world's principal reserve currency and resulted in the creation of two global institutions, the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, or the World Bank, and the International Monetary Fund, or the IMF. The World Bank provided private loans for the reconstruction of war-torn Europe, as well as for the development of third world countries. And the IMF was designed to stabilize the value of currencies, thereby helping to guide the world economy after the war. A second linchpin of post-war prosperity was defense spending. The military-industrial complex that President Eisenhower identified in his 1961 farewell address had its roots in the business-government partnerships of the world wars. But unlike after World War I, the massive commitment of government dollars for defense continued after 1945. As permanent mobilization took hold, science, industry, and the federal government became increasingly intertwined. According to the National Science Foundation, federal money underwrote 90% of the cost of research on aviation and space, 65% of that on electricity and electronics, 42% of that on scientific instrument, and 24% of that on automobiles. In response then to the Soviet Union launching the satellite Sputnik in 1957, the U.S. accelerated its focus on the Cold War space race. Eisenhower funneled millions of dollars into new college scholarships and university research in science and in technology. By the early 1960s then, perhaps 1 in 7 Americans owed his or her job to the military-industrial complex. But increased military spending also limited the resources for domestic social needs. For more than half a century, American enterprise had favored the consolidation of economic power into big corporate firms. That tendency continued as domestic and world markets increasingly overlapped after 1945. To staff their bureaucracies, the post-war corporate giants required a huge white-collar army. A new generation of corporate chieftains emerged, operating in a complex environment that demanded long-range forecasting. In his work, The Lonely Crowd from 1950, sociologist David Reisman contrasted the independent businessman and professionals of earlier years with the new managerial class of the post-war world. He concluded that the new corporate men were, quote, other-directed, more attuned to their associates than driven by their own goals. From 1947 to 75, worker productivity more than doubled across the whole of the economy. As industries mechanized, they could suddenly turn out products more efficiently and at lower cost. But millions of high-wage manufacturing jobs were lost as machines replaced workers. America's annual GDP also jumped from $213 billion in 1945 to more than $500 billion in 1960. By 1970, it exceeded $1 trillion. This sustained growth provided a 25% rise in real income for ordinary Americans between 1946 and 1959. Americans at the bottom of society, however, struggled to survive. In The Affluent Society from 1958, John Kenneth Galbraith argued that the poor were only an afterthought in the minds of politicians. He noted that 1 in 13 families earned less than $1,000 a year. In The Other America, Michael Harrington chronicled the struggles of the poorest Americans. All right, so let's look at the next section then, a nation of consumers. The most breathtaking development in the post-war American economy was the dramatic expansion of the domestic consumer market. The sheer quantity of consumer goods available to the average person was without precedent. The new ethic of consumption appealed to the post-war middle class. Middle class status was then more accessible than ever because of, again, the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, popularly known as the GI Bill. By 1955, over 2 million veterans had attended college. Another 5.6 million had attended trade school with government financing. Home ownership also increased under its auspices. For blue-collar workers, collective bargaining after World War II became, for the first time, the normal means for determining how their labor would be rewarded. General Motors, therefore, went on to resist labor attacks against the rights of management. The company took a 113-day strike, rebuffed the government's attempts at intervention, and soundly defeated the United Auto Workers Union, the UAW. Having made its point, General Motors laid out the terms for a durable relationship. It would accept the UAW as its bargaining partner and guarantee GM workers an even higher standard of living. The price was that the UAW abandoned its assault on the company's right to manage. On signing the 5-year GM contract of 1950, the Treaty of Detroit it was called, Walter Reuther, leader of the UAW, accepted the company's terms. Though impressive, the Labor Management Accord was never as durable as it seemed. Vulnerabilities lurked, even in the Accord's heyday. For one thing, the sheltered markets, the essential condition, were in fact quite fragile. The post-war Labor Management Accord, it turns out, was a transitory event, not a permanent condition of American economic life. And in the larger sense, that was true of the post-war boom. It was a transitory event, not a permanent condition. Increased educational levels, growing home ownership, and higher wages all enabled more Americans than ever before to become consumers. In the emerging suburban nation, 3 elements came together to create patterns of consumption that would endure for decades. And they were houses, cars, and children. Now, television's leap to cultural prominence was swift and overpowering. There were only 7,000 television sets in American homes in 1947. But a year later, the CBS and NBC radio networks began offering regular television programming. And by 1950, Americans owned 7.3 million television sets. 10 years later, 87% of American homes had at least one television set. What Americans saw on TV, besides the omnipresent commercials, was an overwhelmingly white, Anglo-Saxon world of nuclear families, suburban homes, and middle-class life. All right, let's go to the last section then, religion and the middle class. In an age of anxiety, Americans yearned for a reaffirmation of faith. Church membership jumped from 49% of the population in 1940 to 70% of the population in 1960. People flocked, especially to the evangelical Protestant denominations, which benefited from a remarkable new crop of preachers. Most notable was the young Reverend Billy Graham, who made brilliant use of television, radio, and advertising to spread the gospel. The resurgence of religion, despite its evangelical bent, had a distinctly moderate tone. An ecumenical movement bringing Catholics, Protestants, and Jews together flourished, and so did a concern for the here and now. Okay, so that concludes our video lecture then for today. Economy from recovery to dominance. Go ahead and answer your review questions at this time and continue on with your work.